They were watching the wrong coast. For months, German commanders studied maps, tide tables, aerial photos, intercepted messages. Everything pointed to one conclusion: the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. It was closer to England, had better ports, and made perfect strategic sense. Normandy, in their minds, was a distraction, a feint, a secondary landing meant to pull forces away from the real blow. But history does not always reward logic. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, while most of the German High Command slept, the sky over Normandy began to fill with aircraft. Paratroopers dropped into darkness, scattered by wind and anti-aircraft fire, landing in fields, swamps, and hedgerows. Many were lost before firing a single shot. Others regrouped instinctively, guided by training, fear, and sheer will to survive. On the beaches below, the sea was already crowded with silhouettes. Thousands of landing craft moved through rough water toward a coastline that, on German maps, was marked as unlikely. The Atlantic Wall existed here, but it was thinner, less reinforced, and manned by a mix of experienced soldiers and conscripts who never expected to face the full weight of an invasion. This was not supposed to happen here. If you want to understand how a single miscalculation turned Normandy into hell, leave a comment with the word Normandy, and stay with me until the end. As the first light of dawn broke, German sentries began to realize something was terribly wrong. Naval bombardment thundered across the coast, shaking bunkers and collapsing communication lines. The ground itself seemed to rise and fall with each explosion. Officers reached for field telephones that no longer worked. Runners were sent. Orders became guesses. And still, many commanders hesitated. Reports of airborne troops were dismissed as raids. The landings were believed to be the long-expected diversion. The real attack, they assumed, would come later, farther north. This belief was not stubbornness alone. It was the result of one of the most sophisticated deception campaigns ever executed in warfare. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, double agents feeding carefully crafted lies. An entire phantom army had convinced Germany that Normandy was not the target. Even as Allied soldiers fought and died on the sand, the most powerful armored divisions in Europe remained idle, waiting for an invasion that would never come. On the beaches, there was no room for doubt. At Omaha, the tide pushed bodies and equipment back toward the shore. Landing ramps dropped, and men were cut down in seconds. Units dissolved into fragments. Officers fell. Medics crawled through fire. The carefully planned assault unraveled almost immediately, replaced by chaos and individual acts of courage. German defenders, stunned but deadly, fired from concrete emplacements overlooking the beach. They had the height, the fields of fire, and the advantage of preparation. What they did not have was reinforcements, clear orders, or permission to move freely. Every decision required approval from higher command, and higher command was still convinced this was not the main event. Behind the beaches, Normandy itself became a trap. Thick hedgerows turned fields into natural fortresses. Visibility was measured in meters, not kilometers. Every advance became a close-range fight, where grenades and rifles mattered more than tanks and doctrine. German units that tried to counterattack often ran into paratroopers they did not even know were there. The invasion was succeeding, but at a cost so high that many on both sides believed it might still fail. By midday, reports flooded German headquarters. 5 beaches, massive naval support, thousands of troops ashore. Still, the question lingered. Was this the real invasion, or merely the opening act? That hesitation, measured in hours, would change the course of the war. And as the sun climbed higher over Normandy, the illusion finally began to crack, but far too late. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received the reports with growing unease. This was no small raid. The scale alone defied everything Germany had prepared for. Yet doctrine, deception, and Adolf Hitler's personal control over the armored reserves created paralysis. The panzer divisions that could have crushed the beachheads within the first critical hours were held back, locked behind layers of authorization that could not be broken without the Führer himself. And Hitler was asleep. When he was finally awakened, the picture he received was fragmented and contradictory. Some advisors insisted Normandy was the feint they had predicted for months. Others warned that the Allies had committed too much to be bluffing. Hitler chose caution. He ordered the panzer divisions to remain in place, waiting for the true invasion at Pas-de-Calais. On the ground, that decision translated into blood. American soldiers at Omaha clawed their way off the sand, finding cover behind obstacles, corpses, and shattered equipment. Small groups formed without orders, led by whoever was still standing. They climbed the bluffs under machine gun fire, using craters and smoke as shields. Each bunker silenced was not part of a grand plan, but the result of desperate initiative. At Utah, the current pushed landing craft off course, an error that unexpectedly saved lives. The beach defenses were lighter, and the troops faced less resistance than anticipated. What could have been a disaster became a foothold, allowing men and vehicles to pour inland faster than planners dared hope. British and Canadian forces faced their own trials at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Towns turned into kill zones. Streets became sniper alleys. Tanks bogged down or burned, while engineers raced to clear obstacles under fire. The goal was simple and terrifying: move inland before German counterattacks could assemble. But the counterattacks came piecemeal. Without coordinated armor and clear authority, German units fought locally, bravely, and often effectively, yet without the mass needed to throw the invaders back into the sea. Officers argued over maps that no longer matched reality. Communication lines were cut repeatedly by bombardment and airborne troops. Orders arrived too late, or contradicted what commanders saw with their own eyes. The deception still held. Even as entire divisions engaged in Normandy, German intelligence reported suspicious activity across the Channel. Dummy camps remained visible from the air. Radio chatter continued. Double agents confirmed that the main blow was imminent elsewhere. The result was a fatal delay, measured not in days but in hours that could never be recovered. By the evening of June 6th, the Allies had secured a tenuous but real lodgment. It was not the sweeping breakthrough promised by planners, but it was enough. Supplies began to flow. Artillery was brought ashore. Engineers carved makeshift ports and roads out of sand and ruin. Normandy was no longer a question mark. It was a battlefield. For the civilians trapped between advancing armies, hell arrived without warning. Homes became shelters, then targets. Livestock ran loose through burning fields. Families hid in cellars while shells passed overhead, unsure which side would emerge from the smoke. Liberation and destruction arrived together, inseparable. German commanders now understood the truth, but understanding did not equal control. When Hitler finally released the armored reserves, Allied air power shredded their movements. Columns were bombed, strafed, delayed. What should have been a decisive counterstroke dissolved into scattered engagements. The invasion had survived its most vulnerable day, yet survival did not mean victory. Ahead lay weeks of brutal fighting through hedgerows, villages, and rivers, where every meter would be paid for in lives. The German army, though wounded by delay, was far from broken. Normandy was only beginning to reveal what it would demand from both sides. As the days after the landing stretched on, the battlefield transformed into something no planner had fully anticipated. Normandy's hedgerows, ancient earth embankments topped with thick vegetation, became walls of death. Designed centuries earlier to divide farmland, they now divided armies. Every field was a potential ambush. Every crossing demanded blood. Allied troops advanced yard by yard. Tanks could not see over the hedgerows, making them vulnerable to anti-tank weapons fired from just meters away. Infantry learned quickly that speed meant nothing without caution. German defenders, experienced and disciplined, adapted faster than expected. They mined the narrow gaps, zeroed artillery on predictable routes, and used the terrain with lethal efficiency. This was where the German army fought best. Small unit tactics replaced grand strategy. A single machine gun nest could halt an entire company. Snipers controlled roads and village squares. Mortar fire arrived suddenly without warning, then vanished before counterfire could respond. The front line was no longer a line at all, but a shifting maze of danger. For German soldiers, the realization that Normandy was not a feint came with grim clarity. They were now ordered to hold at all costs. Retreat was discouraged. Initiative was punished if it contradicted orders. The same rigid command structure that delayed the response now demanded absolute resistance, and resistance came at a terrible price. Allied air superiority dominated the daylight hours. German movement became nearly impossible under the open sky. Supply convoys moved only at night, headlights off, engines muffled, hoping to avoid detection. Fuel shortages worsened. Ammunition became precious. Wounded soldiers often waited hours, sometimes days, before evacuation was possible. Yet the German defense did not collapse. Villages like Carentan, Caen, and Saint-Lô turned into symbols of the grinding struggle. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Rubble replaced streets. What was captured at dawn could be lost by dusk. Civilians who had survived the initial bombardments now faced starvation, displacement, and constant fear. In Caen, British forces met especially fierce resistance. The city, a key objective meant to fall quickly, became a stubborn anchor for German defenses. Armored divisions dug in, using the ruins as cover. Every attempt to break through was met with counterfire and counterattacks that bled both sides. The longer the fighting dragged on, the clearer the consequences of the initial German hesitation became. Had the armored reserves struck decisively on the first day, the Allies might have been pushed back into the sea. Now, those same reserves were being fed into battle piecemeal, losing strength with every engagement. Still, German commanders searched for an opportunity to reverse the tide. Plans formed for a massive counter-offensive, one that would cut through the Allied lines and reach the coast. It was a desperate gamble, born from necessity rather than confidence. The goal was no longer victory in Normandy, but disruption, delay, and hope for a political or strategic miracle. For Allied troops, the cost of progress weighed heavily. Exhaustion set in, casualties mounted, replacements arrived inexperienced and untested. The promise of a swift breakout faded into the reality of attrition. Each hedgerow cleared revealed another beyond it. Normandy had become a battle of endurance, and as both sides prepared for the next phase, a decision was taking shape within the German High Command, one that would attempt to undo the consequences of that first, fatal assumption. The German counteroffensive was given a name filled with false confidence. Operation Lüttich was intended to slice through the American lines near Mortain and drive west toward the coast. If successful, it would split the Allied forces and threaten the fragile supply routes that kept the invasion alive. On paper, it was bold. In reality, it was already doomed. The attack began under cover of darkness, the only protection German units still possessed. Tanks rolled forward low on fuel, crews exhausted, formations incomplete. Many commanders knew the risks, but orders were orders. The belief lingered that one powerful blow could still change everything. Allied intelligence knew it was coming. Intercepted communications and aerial reconnaissance revealed the build-up almost immediately. When German armor moved at dawn, it emerged into a sky that belonged entirely to the Allies. Fighter bombers descended in waves, striking columns trapped on narrow roads. Explosions tore vehicles apart, leaving twisted metal and burning wreckage behind. What reached the front lines was a shadow of the intended force. American units, hardened by weeks in the hedgerows, held their ground. They used terrain, artillery, and close coordination to blunt the assault. German tanks advanced without adequate infantry support, becoming targets rather than spearheads. By the time the offensive stalled, the last meaningful chance to disrupt the invasion had vanished. From that moment, the strategic initiative shifted permanently. The Allies prepared their own breakout. Operation Cobra aimed to shatter the German front with overwhelming firepower. Bombers carpeted enemy positions, turning defensive lines into fields of craters and confusion. The bombardment was devastating, sometimes tragically inaccurate, but its effect was undeniable. German cohesion began to fracture. Units that had fought stubbornly for weeks found themselves isolated, short of supplies and increasingly surrounded. Command and control disintegrated as roads clogged with retreating troops, wounded soldiers, and refugees. What had been an organized defense became a struggle to escape annihilation. The encirclement near Falaise closed slowly but relentlessly. German forces attempted to withdraw through narrow corridors under constant air attack. Vehicles were abandoned. Horses were cut loose. Men moved on foot, exhausted and hungry, stepping over the dead and wounded as they tried to reach safety. Normandy had become a graveyard of armies. For civilians, the end of fighting did not mean immediate relief. Entire towns lay in ruins. Fields were littered with unexploded ordnance. The smell of decay hung over the countryside. Liberation arrived, but it arrived scarred. German soldiers who escaped the pocket carried with them the memory of what delay and misjudgment had cost. They had not lost because they lacked courage or skill. They had lost because they had prepared for the wrong battle, on the wrong coast, at the wrong moment. The belief in a feint had shaped every decision that followed. As Allied forces pushed east toward the Seine, the scale of what had been achieved became clear. Western Europe was opening. The German army in France was broken beyond recovery. What remained was a long retreat, fought not for victory, but for survival. And behind all of it stood a single assumption, made months earlier, that Normandy could never be the main event. The retreat from Normandy was not a clean withdrawal, but a collapse stretched over weeks. German units moved east under constant pressure, harassed from the air and pursued on the ground. Bridges were destroyed behind them, sometimes too early, stranding their own men. What discipline remained was enforced through fear rather than cohesion. For many soldiers, the war changed here. The illusion of control vanished. Orders were ignored out of necessity. Equipment was discarded to keep moving. Columns broke apart as men searched for food, water, or simply a place to rest. The retreat became a test of endurance rather than obedience. Allied forces advanced rapidly once free of the hedgerows. Armored divisions surged forward across open ground, exploiting gaps that could no longer be sealed. Towns fell in hours instead of weeks. The tempo of war shifted dramatically, and the German army struggled to adapt. Behind the front, the consequences of the original deception became undeniable. The fictional invasion force at Pas-de-Calais had achieved its purpose perfectly. Even after Normandy was lost, German commanders continued to fear a second landing that would never come. Resources were wasted guarding empty beaches while real battles raged elsewhere. This lingering doubt weakened every subsequent defense. Supplies that could have stabilized collapsing fronts were held back. Units that might have reinforced shattered divisions remained stationary. The shadow of the Feint followed Germany all the way to its borders. For the Allies, Normandy became a lesson in both success and sacrifice. Victory had been achieved, but at enormous cost. Tens of thousands were dead or wounded. Entire divisions were worn down. The price of breaking into Europe was far higher than most had imagined. Yet the breakthrough changed everything. France began to fall rapidly. Paris was liberated. German forces retreated toward the Rhine. The Western Front, once thought impenetrable, now moved at a pace that shocked even Allied planners. Within the German High Command, blame spread quietly. Some pointed to intelligence failures. Others blamed rigid command structures or political interference. Few openly challenged the central mistake, the belief that logic alone could predict the enemy's actions. Normandy had proven otherwise. The assumption that the Allies would choose the most obvious route became a trap. By exploiting that expectation, the invasion turned deception into a weapon as powerful as any army. When the truth emerged, it emerged too late to stop the consequences. For those who fought there, Normandy was remembered not as a clever plan, but as a place of relentless violence. The beaches, the hedgerows, the ruined villages, each became a chapter written in blood. And as the war pushed eastward, the echoes of that first morning on June 6th continued to shape every decision, every retreat, and every desperate stand. Aguardo sua aprovação para prosseguir para a parte 6. Parte 6. Aproximadamente 6,000 caracteres. By the time Allied forces reached Germany's borders, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. What remained uncertain was how long it would take, and how many more lives would be lost before the end arrived. Normandy had not ended the conflict, but it had made defeat inevitable. Inside Germany, the lessons of that summer were studied quietly and bitterly. The failure was not a lack of soldiers or weapons, but a failure of perception. The German command had trusted patterns, assumptions, and expectations more than reality unfolding in front of them. By the time those assumptions were challenged, the moment to act had already passed. Normandy stood as proof that modern war was no longer decided solely by strength, but by information, deception, and speed of decision. For Allied commanders, the invasion validated years of preparation and risk. They had gambled everything on a narrow strip of coast, knowing that failure would have prolonged the war indefinitely. The success was incomplete, costly and chaotic, but it was real. Europe was no longer sealed behind an impenetrable wall. For the soldiers who landed there, victory was a distant concept. What they remembered were moments. The sound of ramps dropping, the weight of wet sand pulling at their boots, the fear that came before movement, and the silence that followed gunfire. They remembered friends who did not leave the beach, fields, or villages alive. Normandy was not an abstract turning point. It was a place where survival was earned minute by minute. German soldiers remembered it differently, but no less vividly. They remembered waiting for orders that never came, watching aircraft dominate the sky without opposition, fighting with skill and resolve, only to be undone by decisions made far behind the lines. Many carried the knowledge that the battle had been lost before it truly began. Civilians carried their own memories. Families returned to homes that no longer existed. Fields had to be cleared of metal before they could be planted again. Churches, schools, and town centers were rebuilt stone by stone. Liberation was followed by years of recovery, shaped by loss as much as hope. Today, Normandy is quiet. The beaches are wide and calm. The hedgerows still divide the land, unchanged by the passage of time. Cemeteries stretch across the countryside, row after row of names, many marked only by age and unit. They stand as reminders of what happens when assumptions replace vigilance. The German command expected a feint. They prepared for the obvious, the logical, the predictable. Instead, they faced an enemy willing to challenge expectations, to risk everything on surprise, and to exploit hesitation without mercy. In war, that difference can decide the fate of nations. Normandy became hell not because it was inevitable, but because it was underestimated, and in that underestimation the course of history was permanently altered.